Hold on, Lily. I have you. Vital stabilizing.
Stop the procedure now!
I will finish this operation.
The clock on the operating room wall glowed red. 23 minutes. 51 seconds. Counting down, not up because someone had said it that way on purpose, to remind every person in that room that a child's body only forgives so much blood loss before it stops forgiving anything at all. Dr. Naomi Reyes stood over the open incision with both hands steady inside a 9-year-old girl named Lily Bennett. Blood soaked through her blue gloves in a slow, spreading bloom across the fabric of her gown. Behind her, the heart monitor gave a thin, uneven beep, dipping lower with every passing second, a sound that would have sent most people in that room running for the door. Naomi did not run. She had never once run from a bleeding patient in 11 years, and she was not going to start tonight, not with a 9-year-old's life measured out in a shrinking window of red numbers above her head. Stop. Stop right now. The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Whitfield, chief of surgery, and it cracked the sealed calm of the operating room in half. He shoved through the doors in his white coat, his badge still swinging from its clip, his face pale with something that looked like fear wearing the mask of authority. Step away from that table, Dr. Reyes. That is a direct order. Beside her, Dr. Julian Cross lifted a bloodied, shaking finger and pointed it at Naomi like she was the one who had done something wrong. She's not following the surgical plan. She went off protocol. If that child dies here, it's on her. Naomi did not look up. Her hands did not slow. Somewhere behind her mask, her jaw was set the way it got set only once or twice a year, when she had already decided something and no title in the building could talk her out of it. Nurses along the wall froze mid-motion. A security guard hovered near the doorway, unsure whether the situation in front of him called for force or for silence. Nobody in that room had ever seen the chief of surgery cross the sterile field before. Naomi had learned a long time ago, working in emergency rooms and trauma bays from her very first year of residency, that the loudest voice in a room is rarely the one telling the truth. Panic is loud. Guilt is loud. The truth, more often than people expect, is quiet, and it waits patiently inside a person's body for someone willing to actually look for it. Tonight, she intended to keep looking, no matter who was shouting at her to stop. Greetings, gentle viewers, and welcome back to the ranch. Before the story rides any further, if this is your first evening with us, consider joining the family here. There's a whole shelf of these tales waiting for you and more coming every week. 6 hours earlier, Naomi Reyes had been asleep, curled under a single blanket in her small apartment near Lake Union, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after a run of 60-hour weeks finally lets a person rest. Her phone lit up the ceiling first, then buzzed against the nightstand hard enough to knock a water glass sideways. Cascade Grace Medical Center urgent. She had worked at Cascade Grace for 11 years, long enough to know that an urgent page at midnight rarely meant something simple, and long enough to know she would answer it anyway, the way she always did, the way the job had quietly trained her to. By the time she reached the hospital, dressed in yesterday's scrubs with her hair still damp, Chief Marcus Whitfield was already waiting for her outside the trauma bay, his tie loosened, his voice pitched unusually warm and easy for a man normally allergic to warmth. Routine pediatric case, he told her, falling into step beside her down the corridor. Small mass needs to come out tonight before it grows any further. I want my best surgeon on it. Naomi had worked under Marcus Whitfield for 6 of her 11 years at Cascade Grace. In that time she had learned 2 things about him that never failed to hold true. He never came in after midnight for a case he genuinely believed was routine. And he never called anyone his best surgeon unless he needed something from that surgeon that he was not prepared to ask for directly. Whose case was this originally? She asked. Mine, Whitfield said, a beat too fast. I'm handing it to you because you're better in there than I am, and this little girl deserves the best hands in the building tonight. It was, Naomi would later realize, the only completely honest sentence he said to her all night, and even that one was honest for reasons he never intended. She should have paid closer attention to the unease settling low in her stomach right then, in the hallway, before she had even seen the patient's face. She would spend the rest of the night learning exactly how right that unease had been. Greetings, gentle viewers, and welcome back to the ranch. Before the story rides any further, if this is your first evening with us, consider joining the family here. There's a whole shelf of these tales waiting for you and more coming every week. The pediatric wing was quiet at that hour, lit only by the soft blue glow of monitors and the amber night lights running along the baseboards. Naomi found the patient file waiting for her on a tablet outside room 4. Lily Bennett, age 9, admitted for evaluation of abdominal pain and a mass detected on imaging earlier that evening. Lily's mother, Rachel Bennett, sat folded into a plastic chair beside the bed, a teacher's lanyard still hanging around her neck from a school day that had ended in an emergency room instead of a classroom full of second graders. She looked up when Naomi entered, and something in her expression, that specific mixture of exhaustion and desperate hope, made Naomi's chest go quiet and careful, the way it always did around frightened parents. "They said it's small," Rachel said, her voice thin. "They said it's routine. Is that true?" "I'm going to look at everything myself before I promise you anything," Naomi said, pulling a chair close enough to sit at eye level with her. "That's how I work. I don't repeat words I haven't checked." Rachel nodded slowly, like she wanted very badly to believe that was enough, and needed a minute to convince herself it was. Naomi asked her the question she always asked. How long had Lily been in pain? Had there been fevers, changes in appetite, any prior surgeries or hospital stays? Rachel answered each one carefully, the way parents do when they are terrified of saying the wrong thing and somehow making everything worse. "No surgeries," Rachel said. "She's never even had stitches. She's the healthiest kid in her class, honestly, until 3 days ago." Naomi wrote that down and carried it with her out into the hallway, where she pulled up the imaging on the tablet and studied it under better light. The scan was recent, clean, and almost too simple. A shadow near the lower right side of the abdomen, labeled by radiology as a likely benign mass, origin unclear. No surgical history listed anywhere in the chart. No prior admissions. A blank page in a place where, if something truly had gone unnoticed inside this child's body for months, there should have been at least a note, a visit, a single line of evidence that anyone had looked closely before tonight. She had reviewed thousands of charts across 11 years of practice, and she had learned that files which are truly clean tend to look lived in. Messy. Full of small, ordinary notes from tired residents documenting normal, boring visits. This one looked scrubbed, in the specific way a room looks scrubbed right before an inspection, when someone has worked hard to make sure nothing looks touched. Dr. Julian Cross stepped into the hallway then, already gowned for surgery, his eyes finding hers the way they used to find hers 3 years earlier, back when the two of them had been something more than colleagues, before a disagreement over a different case had gone quiet and cold and eventually ended everything between them. "You're on this one too," Naomi said. "It wasn't a question. The chief assigned me himself," Julian said. "Said you'd want a familiar face in there with you." "Since when does Whitfield care what I want?" Julian didn't answer that. He looked away first, out toward the nurse's station, and Naomi filed that small silence away with the rest of the discrepancies stacking quietly in her mind, one detail at a time, the exact way she had always built a diagnosis, long before she ever picked up a scalpel to confirm it. "You look tired," she said, softer. "I am," Julian said. "More tired than one bad night's sleep would explain, if that's what you're asking." It wasn't what she'd asked, not out loud, but it was close enough to the truth that she let the sentence sit between them without pushing further. There would be time to push later. There was a patient waiting, and whatever secrets Julian Cross was carrying tonight, Naomi intended to find out exactly what they were before the sun came up. She had learned, working in trauma medicine for over a decade, that the body tells the truth even when the paperwork does not. Tonight, walking toward an operating room with a chart that looked scrubbed clean and a former partner who wouldn't meet her eyes, she had a strong feeling the paperwork was going to lie to her more than once before this case was finished. She thought, briefly, of the last real conversation she and Julian had shared before things went quiet between them. It had been over a different patient, a different chart, a man in his 60s whose family had wanted a treatment plan Naomi believed was wrong for him. Julian had backed the family that day out of kindness, he'd said at the time, not out of any real disagreement with her medicine. Naomi had never been able to separate those two things as cleanly as he seemed to. Kindness that overruled the truth had never looked like kindness to her. It had looked like a decision dressed up to avoid a hard conversation, and she had told him exactly that, and neither of them had ever quite recovered the ease they used to have with each other after it. Standing outside room 4 tonight, watching him avoid her eyes over a chart that made even less sense than that old disagreement had, Naomi wondered whether history was simply repeating itself in a more dangerous way, or whether Julian had finally learned, somewhere in the 3 years since, what it actually cost to choose comfort over honesty. She scrubbed in a few minutes later beside Owen, who was quiet with the particular nervous energy of a resident on only his second month rotating through pediatric surgery. "First time in a case this complicated?" Naomi asked him, working soap up past her wrists. "Second," Owen admitted. "The first time the chart looked this thin though." "Good eye," Naomi said. Trust that instinct. It'll save a patient someday, maybe tonight. Owen didn't answer, but she saw him stand a little straighter at the sink, the way young doctors do the first time someone more senior tells them their instincts are worth something. By 1 in the morning, Lily Bennett was under anesthesia, and the operating room had settled into the particular hush that only surgeons and nurses ever truly know, the hush where every sound has a purpose and every second belongs to the patient rather than to anyone standing over her. Naomi made the first incision with practiced calm, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her hands, running through every version of what she might find beneath the surface. Nurse Priya Patel called out vitals in a steady, unhurried rhythm from her station near the monitors. Dr. Owen Hale, the junior resident, retracted tissue exactly where he was told and stayed silent otherwise, the way good residents learn to during their first real exposure to a complicated case. Heart rate is at 92, Priya said. Copy that, Naomi answered, eyes fixed on the surgical field. Suction here, Owen. Slow and steady. The mask came into view slowly, and immediately something in Naomi's understanding of the case bent sideways. It wasn't shaped like a tumor. Tumors, even aggressive ones, tend to carry a certain organic irregularity, a shape that looks like the body made a mistake growing something on its own without a plan. This had edges that were too straight in places, wrapped in scar tissue that looked old rather than newly formed, layered the way tissue layers itself over months, not days. Julian, she said quietly, the scan called this a primary mass. Does that match what you're seeing from where you're standing? Julian hesitated a half-second too long before answering. Could be old inflammation built up around it. Scans miss texture sometimes. Scans don't usually miss straight edges, Julian. You know that as well as I do. He didn't answer that one either, and this time his silence lasted long enough that Priya glanced up from the monitor, sensing something had shifted in the room that had nothing to do with the patient's vitals. Naomi kept working, cataloging everything in a private, wordless list the way she always did during a difficult case. The scar tissue that didn't match a first-time surgery. The blank chart with no history at all. Whitfield showed up at midnight for something he had called routine, using a warmth in his voice she had never once heard from him in 6 years of working together. Julian's short, careful answers, so unlike the version of him she used to know, the one who used to tell her the truth even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost him something. None of it added up to a story anyone had told her tonight, and every part of her training said that when the story doesn't match the tissue sitting directly in front of you, you trust the tissue every single time. She thought of Rachel Bennett sitting outside in that plastic chair, still wearing her lanyard, believing the word routine simply because a doctor had used it, because parents sitting in waiting rooms rarely have any choice but to trust the words handed to them by people in white coats. Naomi decided, right there under the surgical lights, hands steady inside a 9-year-old's body, that she was not going to hand Rachel Bennett a lie just because a lie would be easier to close the case with and go home to sleep. Widen the retraction 2 centimeters, she said to Owen. I want a full look before I decide anything. That's outside the documented plan, Julian said, and there was something close to warning in his voice now, not for her safety, but for something else entirely, something Naomi could not yet name. The documented plan was written by someone who apparently never looked closely at this chart, Naomi said. I look at what's actually in front of me. That's the only plan I've ever trusted. If you have ever had to hand your trust to a professional for something you had no way of checking yourself, the way Rachel Bennett had just handed hers to a hospital full of strangers, you already understand exactly what was riding on the next few minutes of this operation. Stick around because Naomi is about to earn that trust the hard way. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is. Naomi widened the surgical field carefully, working past the point where the original plan said she should stop. She could feel Julian tense beside her, the particular tension of a person who knows something is about to be found and cannot decide, in the space of a single breath, whether to hope it stays buried a little longer or to finally let it surface. Beneath the layer of scar tissue, her instrument met something that did not belong inside a human body at all. A folded strip of surgical gauze, degraded and darkened, tangled into the scar the way something looks when it has been sitting quietly inside a body for months, slowly turning healthy tissue into a private, festering secret. The room went still. Even the monitor seemed to hold its breath for a second before it beeped again. That's a retained surgical item, Naomi said, her voice flat with the specific kind of calm that surgeons learn to use when panic would help absolutely nobody in the room. This isn't a tumor. This is an infection built around a sponge that somebody left inside this child. Priya's eyes went wide above her mask. Owen went very still, his hands frozen mid-retraction. Julian's hands trembled slightly over the instrument tray. Naomi. Left inside her when Naomi cut in, not raising her voice, because there's no surgical history on this chart at all. No prior operation. No admission. Nothing. I can't, Julian said, so quietly it barely carried past his mask. I can't tell you right now. Please, not right now, not like this. That answer told her more than a full confession would have. Julian Cross was not a man who avoided her questions. 3 years earlier, back when the two of them used to grab coffee at 5 in the morning after overnight shifts and talk through every hard case together, piece by piece, he had been the person who told her the truth even when it cost him something, even when it was easier to stay quiet. Whatever had happened to change that, Naomi felt its absence land somewhere close to where old feelings for him still quietly lived, feelings she had spent 3 years telling herself were finished and gone. Owen, she said, document everything you're seeing exactly as it appears, time-stamped. Priya, I need imaging here to confirm placement before I go any further. On it, Priya said, already reaching for the phone on the wall. Naomi looked at the sponge sitting in the surgical tray, then at the monitor tracking a 9-year-old's heartbeat, then at the closed door of the operating room and understood, with the same certainty she used when reading a difficult scan, that in a few minutes someone was going to walk through that door who very much did not want her to have found what she had just found. Every surgical team in the country counts sponges and instruments before an operation begins and again after it ends, for exactly this reason. It is one of the simplest, oldest safety rules in modern medicine, and it exists because a single missed count can hide inside a patient for months, quietly doing damage long after everyone in the operating room has gone home and stopped thinking about that particular case. Somebody at Cascade Grace had skipped that rule once, 8 months ago by the look of the scarring, and Lily Bennett had been paying the price for it every single day since, without her mother ever knowing there was a price being paid at all. Down the hall, in the family waiting area, Rachel Bennett sat with her hands folded so tightly around a paper cup of vending machine coffee that the sides had started to buckle. She had already called her sister twice, texted Lily's father once, and reread the same consent form 4 separate times without absorbing a single new word from it. A nurse passing through told her the surgery was proceeding as expected, a phrase meant to comfort her that told her nothing at all, and Rachel had nodded and thanked her anyway, because nodding and thanking people was easier than admitting how frightened she actually was. She had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, the surgeon she had trusted her daughter's life to had just found proof that another doctor in this same building had already failed Lily once, months earlier, and had never told anyone. Rachel only knew the ordinary, helpless waiting that every parent in that room had learned to survive one slow minute at a time, trusting a closed door and the people working behind it, because there was nothing else left for her to do with her hands except hold a cooling cup of coffee and wait. The door burst open 11 minutes later, and Chief Marcus Whitfield walked in already talking, his voice pitched to fill the room and shut down every other sound inside it. "What is going on in here?" he demanded, eyes flicking from the tray to the monitor to Naomi's face, one hand already reaching to snap off his own set of gloves as though he might physically insert himself into the case. "Dr. Reyes, my understanding was this was a straightforward mass removal." "Your understanding was wrong," Naomi said without looking up. "This is a retained surgical item. Infected, encapsulated, sitting on top of what looks like old repair work from a prior surgery this child's chart never once mentioned." Whitfield's face did something complicated for a fraction of a second. A flicker of fear quickly folded back into practiced authority. "You are not qualified to make that determination mid-procedure, in the middle of the night, without full imaging support. Close her up. We will investigate properly, through the right channels after she's stable." "She won't be stable if I close her up," Naomi said. "There's active infection tracking toward the bowel wall. If I stop now, I'm not protecting her, I'm protecting whoever's name is supposed to be on the original surgery that put this here in the first place." The digital clock on the wall clicked from 24 minutes to 23, counting down the estimated safe window Naomi had calculated before the infection reached tissue she would no longer be able to repair in time. "Stop. Stop right now," Whitfield said again, his voice climbing, stepping fully into the sterile field, ignoring every rule about who is allowed to cross that line during an active procedure. "Step away from that table, Dr. Reyes. That is a direct order, and if you disregard it, you will not be practicing medicine in this state by the end of the month." Julian's hand rose, finger pointed, his voice cracking with a fear that Naomi was only beginning to understand had very little to do with the patient lying open on the table between them. "She's not following the surgical plan. If that child dies here, it's on her." Naomi lifted her eyes from the incision for the first time since Whitfield had entered, and looked directly at him, steady, unafraid, the way she had looked at difficult attendings when she was still a resident herself and had learned, early, that backing down from a correct answer never once made it more correct. "If I stop now," she said, "she dies from an infection nobody bothered to write down. If I keep going, she has a real chance. You can report me to every board in this state tomorrow morning, and I will answer every single question they ask me in detail, under oath if that's what it takes. But tonight, in this room, I am not walking away from this table." "Security," Whitfield said toward the door, his voice tight. The guard who had drifted into the doorway earlier did not move. He looked at the monitor, at the blood, at the small, still shape of a 9-year-old girl on the table, and did not take a single step forward. Naomi lowered her eyes and went back to work. Whitfield's hands curled into fists at his sides, the posture of someone who had built an entire career on people obeying the authority of his white coat without question, now standing in a room where that authority had simply stopped functioning. "You understand what this means for you?" he said, quieter now, almost pleading in a way that surprised even him. "You're licensed, Naomi. Everything you've built here." "I understand exactly what it means," Naomi said, not slowing her hands for a second. "It means tomorrow I answer for every decision I made in this room tonight in full, to anyone who asks. I've never once been afraid of that conversation. You should ask yourself whether you can say the same thing about the one you're about to have." Something in Whitfield's expression cracked, just slightly, the look of a man realizing the ground beneath his own authority had already given way, hours before he'd noticed it happening. Whitfield did not leave. He stood at the edge of the sterile field, arms crossed, watching Naomi work with the expression of a man calculating exactly how much damage was already done, and exactly how much more he could still manage to contain before morning. "Owen, Page Hospital Security again and legal counsel. Now," he said without looking away from Naomi. Owen glanced toward Naomi, uncertain, one hand hovering near the phone mounted on the wall. "Leave it," Naomi said quietly, not unkindly. "Finish holding retraction the way I showed you. I need both your hands right here, not on a phone call that can wait 10 more minutes." Owen stayed exactly where he was. It was a small thing, a junior resident choosing his surgeon over his chief in front of an entire room, but Naomi noticed it, filed it away gently, and so, unmistakably, did Whitfield. It was Julian who broke first, the way Naomi had known, somewhere underneath her focus on the surgical field, that he eventually would, because whatever else had changed about him in 3 years, he had never once been built for carrying a lie quietly for very long. "She had surgery here 8 months ago," Julian said, his voice raw, the words coming faster now, like a dam that had finally given way after holding back too much for too long. "Emergency appendectomy. Dr. Whitfield performed it himself. There was a complication during closing, and the final sponge count came up wrong at the end of the case, and instead of reporting it the way protocol requires, it got logged as resolved." "Julian, that's enough," Whitfield warned. "I was the resident in that case too," Julian continued, unable to stop now that he had started. "He told me the count had been fixed before the paperwork went through. I found out 3 weeks later that it hadn't been fixed at all. By then my name was already on the file as having personally verified the final count. He kept that record on file ever since, and every time I thought about reporting it myself, he reminded me exactly what that record would do to a resident's entire career the moment anyone looked at it." Naomi's hands did not stop moving, steady over the tissue in front of her, but something inside her chest settled quietly into place, the same feeling she got when a confusing set of symptoms finally clicked into a single, coherent diagnosis after hours of uncertainty. "So tonight wasn't about protecting a patient at all," she said. "It was about you protecting yourself from something you should have reported 8 months ago, the night it happened." Julian didn't answer that directly. He didn't need to. His silence had already answered for him, the same way his silence 3 years earlier, during a disagreement about a different case, had quietly ended the relationship the two of them used to share outside these walls. Naomi remembered exactly how that silence had felt back then, and for one unguarded moment, standing with her hands inside a child's body while a room full of people watched her entire career hang in the balance, she let herself feel it again, not as anger this time, but as something closer to grief for a version of Julian Cross she used to trust without any hesitation at all. "You could have told me any of this 6 hours ago," she said, softer now, meant only for him. "I know," Julian said. "I was scared of what it would cost me. I'm still scared of what it's going to cost me now. But I'm done being scared quietly. That much I know for certain." Whitfield's face had gone pale in a different way now, the color of a man watching his own carefully built version of events come apart thread by thread in front of witnesses he could no longer control. "He didn't just threaten my career," Julian added, quieter now, as though the worst of the confession had already passed and what remained was simply the plain truth. He reminded me every few weeks. A comment in the hallway. A note about my references before my board exams. Small things, never big enough on their own to report, but they added up into a kind of quiet that I told myself was temporary. I kept thinking I'd find the right moment to fix it properly instead of just living inside it. There's no such thing as the right moment for something like that, Naomi said. There's only the moment you finally decide the truth matters more than the fear does. You found that moment about 8 months later than you should have, but you found it. That's not nothing, Julian. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't managed to since she'd walked into that hallway hours earlier. 3 years ago, when I backed away from what you were trying to tell me was right, I told myself I was keeping the peace. I've had a lot of time tonight to realize that's just another word for staying quiet when it costs you something to speak. Naomi didn't answer that directly, not with the case still open in front of her and a clock still counting down above their heads, but she filed the sentence away carefully, the same way she filed away everything worth remembering, and let herself feel for just a moment, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite forgiveness either, but sat somewhere honest in between the two. The clock read 9 minutes when Naomi finally isolated the last of the infected tissue and began the delicate work of repairing what 8 months of silence had allowed to spread further than it ever should have. Whitfield, she said, not stopping her hands, you can stand there and watch me finish, or you can walk out and start preparing your statement for the ethics board, because either way this repair is happening and either way what you did 8 months ago is about to be on record by morning. Whitfield's authority, so loud only minutes earlier, had gone brittle in his hands. He could not order security to physically remove a surgeon from an active procedure without creating a record far worse than the one he was already trying so hard to protect. He could not argue medicine with a room that had just heard, in his own former resident's voice, exactly why the chart had been left empty. All he could do was stand very still near the wall and watch his own cover-up collapse in real time, second by second, alongside the clock ticking down above his head. 7 minutes, Priya said, eyes fixed on the monitor. Heart rate stabilizing. 98 and holding steady. Naomi worked in careful, unhurried motions, the kind of calm that only comes from years of learning that panic has never once helped a single patient survive anything. Around her, the room had quietly reorganized itself without anyone announcing that it was happening. Owen followed her instructions instantly, without hesitation. Priya called out numbers with steady, practiced confidence. Julian, quiet now, assisted exactly where she needed him, his earlier fear replaced by something closer to focus, the look of a person finally doing the thing he should have done 8 months earlier, when it might have spared everyone this particular night. For minutes, Priya said. She's holding. She's actually holding. With 2 minutes remaining on the clock, Naomi closed the last layer of repair and watched the monitor settle into a rhythm that finally, unmistakably, matched what a healthy 9-year-old's heartbeat was supposed to look like. She's stable, Naomi said, and for the first time all night, allowed herself one full, unguarded breath. Let's close her up properly this time. All the way correctly with a count everyone in this room personally verifies twice. Nobody needed her to explain what those last words meant. Every person still standing in that operating room already understood exactly what kind of mistake they were making, absolutely certain never happened again, not tonight, not on their watch, not to this child or any other child who might come through those doors after her. Whitfield turned and walked out without another word, his footsteps fast and uneven against the tile, a man retreating from a room he no longer had any power left inside. Lily Bennett woke up in recovery 2 hours later, groggy and confused, but breathing steadily on her own, her vitals holding her mother's hand wrapped tightly around hers. Naomi stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, letting herself simply watch a family get to keep each other for a while longer. You saved her, Rachel said, when Naomi finally came in and sat beside the bed. Her own body helped a great deal, Naomi said. I just made sure the truth got to catch up with her in time to matter. Rachel didn't fully understand yet what that sentence meant, not that night, but she would in the weeks that followed, when a formal letter from the hospital's patient safety office arrived at her door explaining exactly what had been found during Lily's surgery and exactly what steps were being taken because of it. By morning, the hospital's ethics board and legal counsel had opened a formal review into the case. Julian gave a full statement on the record, describing the 8-month cover-up in detail and the pressure Whitfield had used to keep him silent about it. It cost him a difficult season of scrutiny, hearings, and uncomfortable questions from colleagues who had once respected him without a second thought. But it also gave him back something he had been quietly missing since the night he first stayed silent. The ability to look at himself in a mirror each morning without flinching away from what he saw there. 2 weeks later, Naomi sat in a small conference room across from the hospital's ethics panel, describing everything she had found, step by step, in plain, careful language. When one of the panel members asked her why she hadn't simply followed the chief of surgery's direct order to stop, she answered without hesitation. "Because my duty was to the patient on that table, not to the person giving the order," she said. A license means nothing if the person holding it stops asking whether an order is actually right before following it. Another panel member asked whether she had considered, even for a moment, simply following the order and raising the concern afterward through official channels. Naomi thought about that question longer than any other one they asked her. "I did consider it," she said finally. "For about 2 seconds. Then I looked at the clock on that wall and did the math on how many minutes, afterward, would actually leave her, and I understood that the official channel you're describing would have been a channel for a different case entirely, one where the patient survived long enough to benefit from it. I wasn't willing to gamble her life on paperwork moving faster than an infection." Nobody on the panel had an answer for that, and after a long pause, the chair simply thanked her and moved on to the next question. Whitfield was placed on administrative leave within the week, pending a full investigation by the state medical board. The retained sponge and the falsified chart formed the center of a case that would eventually reach far beyond Cascade Grace's own walls, into a formal review of how surgical counts were documented and verified across the entire hospital system. Owen, still new enough to the profession to be genuinely shaped by what he had witnessed, would tell the story for years afterward as the night he learned what it actually looks like when a doctor chooses a patient over her own paycheck and her own comfort, without a single second of visible hesitation. Naomi found Julian on the hospital roof 2 nights later, the city lights spread out quietly below them, both of them still half in scrubs, both of them too tired to pretend the last 72 hours hadn't changed something important between them. "I owe you an apology that's about 3 years overdue," Julian said, leaning against the railing beside her. "Not just for this week. For the first time I ever let a title outrank what I actually knew was right back when we were still together. I think that's really where I lost you if I'm honest with myself about it." "You did lose me there," Naomi said honestly, no bitterness left in it now, only plain truth. "But you found your way back to it tonight, in front of the people it mattered most in front of, when it would have been far easier to keep quiet. That counts for something. It counts for a lot, actually." He reached for her hand slowly, giving her every chance in the world to pull away first. She didn't. The city hummed quietly beneath them, and for the first time in a long while, the silence stretching between them felt like something worth staying inside rather than something either of them needed to escape from. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once again," Julian said. "I know that's not how it works." "Good," Naomi said, the corner of her mouth finally lifting into something close to a real smile. "Because I wasn't about to offer it that quickly anyway." But she stepped closer to him all the same, close enough that neither of them needed to say anything else for a while, and when he finally leaned in and kissed her, gently, like a question rather than an answer he was assuming he already had, she let 3 careful years of distance between them close as quietly as the incision she had sealed only 2 nights before. Lily Bennett went home 9 days later, fully healed, with a mother who never again had to wonder whether a doctor's word could be trusted completely, because one doctor, on one impossible night, had refused to let a lie wear a white coat and walk out of that operating room clean. There is a rule in every operating room in this country requiring every sponge, every instrument, every piece of gauze to be counted before a patient is closed and counted again after, precisely because a single missed count can hide inside a person for months, silently doing damage long after everyone involved has gone home and stopped thinking about that particular case. It exists because patients hand their doctors a kind of trust they have no real way to verify themselves, and that trust only survives when the people holding it choose honesty even when silence would be easier, quieter, and far safer for their own careers. Naomi Reyes chose honesty in a room full of people urging her to choose comfort instead, and a 9-year-old girl got to keep growing up because of that single choice, made in under 24 minutes, under a clock that never once stopped counting down. If a story about refusing to look away, even when the most powerful person in the room is ordering you to, meant something to you tonight, then you already understand exactly why Naomi Reyes couldn't put down that scalpel no matter how loudly she was told to. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.